Picture this. You're standing on a dock in Seville in the late 1500s. The air smells of tar, salt, and sweat. Church bells ring, crowds roar. And on the horizon, sails appear, an armada of fat-bellied galleons, so heavy with treasure they ride low in the water. Each ship is stuffed with silver and gold ripped from the mountains of Mexico and Peru. Potosí, Zacatecas, names that sound like magic spells in Europe. Coffers crash onto the planks, so heavy 2 men can barely shift one. Inside, enough silver to buy kingdoms, enough gold to buy armies, enough treasure, people say, to make Spain rich forever. Now fast forward just a century. The same docks are quiet, the ships are fewer. Behind the waterfront, elegant merchants' houses sit empty, shutters nailed shut. Workshops that once rang with hammers and looms stand silent. In Madrid, the king's government is bankrupt again. Cities are shrinking, fields are abandoned. Spain, the mightiest empire on earth, is broke. This is the only empire in history that defaulted on its debts 5 times in a century while swimming in silver. How do you even do that? How do you turn the biggest jackpot in history into a slow economic suicide? This is the story of Spain's gold addiction, or more accurately, its silver addiction. A 150-year high that turned into one of the most spectacular economic crashes the world has ever seen. Now imagine Europe around 1500. The Black Death is a grim memory. Populations are still low, prices are relatively stable. Money, actual coins of silver and gold, is scarce. A peasant might spend his whole life without touching a gold coin. Then, Spain happens. In 1492, the last Muslim kingdom of Granada falls. The Reconquista is complete. That same year, Columbus crosses the Atlantic. Within decades, conquistadors topple the Aztec and Inca empires and crack open something Europe has never seen: an industrial-scale river of precious metal. Think of Potosí in modern Bolivia as a silver volcano, a mountain almost made of ore. Miners carve tunnels through it day and night, hauling rock that sparkles even before refinement. Further north in Zacatecas, in today's Mexico, another silver rush explodes. By the end of the 1500s, historians estimate that over 16,000 tons of silver and 180 tons of gold have officially entered Spain. Smuggled metal pushes the real figure even higher. All of it pours through one funnel, the port of Seville, under the watch of the Casa de Contratación, the House of Trade. On paper, this is the engine of empire. Spanish kings believe this treasure will pay for everything: armies, palaces, wars, and glory. And at first, it does seem like a dream. Spain's cities swell, the wool trade booms, the merchant marine rivals the Dutch. Seville and Madrid glitter with new churches, palaces, and plazas. This is the Siglo de Oro, the Spanish Golden Age. El Greco paints elongated saints. Cervantes writes Don Quixote. On the battlefield, Spanish tercios, disciplined squares of pikemen and musketeers, crush enemies from Italy to the Low Countries. From the outside, it looks like proof of a comforting idea: more money equals more wealth. But silver isn't wealth, it's a tool. And Spain is about to use that tool like a man trying to hammer in a nail with a wine glass. Picture the king's desk in Madrid. On one side, maps of an empire on which the sun never sets. From the Philippines to Peru, from Naples to the Netherlands. On the other, piles of bills, armies to pay, fortresses to build, shipyards to feed, wars against Protestants in Germany and the rebellious Dutch, fleets to hold back the Ottoman Turks, squadrons to hunt English and French raiders in the Caribbean. It's like trying to fight 3 world wars at once. And for every problem, the king has the same answer. Don't worry, more silver is coming. The crown borrows greedily, mostly from powerful German and Italian banking families, the Fugas, the Genoese. They advance money now in exchange for future shipments of bullion. Here's the first big turning point. In 1545, Spain discovers Potosí. In 1546, Zacatecas. Global silver production quadruples by 1600. Spain hits the resource jackpot. The king looks at those numbers and thinks the game is rigged in his favor. But there's a catch. Several, actually. To reach Spain, all that silver must be blasted from mountains, hauled by mule to coastal ports, loaded onto galleons, then shepherded across pirate-infested, hurricane-racked oceans. Storms swallow whole convoys. English and Dutch privateers pounce like wolves. Entire fortunes vanish between Veracruz and Seville. So, when shipments are late, or never arrive, the Spanish crown simply can't pay what it owes. In 1557, something unthinkable happens. The richest monarch in Europe declares bankruptcy. It's the first of several sovereign defaults. The Empire of Silver can't meet its bills. If you're a banker in Antwerp, what do you do when the mightiest king on earth just stops paying you? You either demand brutal interest rates or you walk away. Spain chooses the first path. It restructures, borrows again, leans even harder on future silver shipments. But every crisis leaves a scar. By the late 1600s, nobody in Europe wants to lend to Spain cheaply. The empire isn't running a budget, it's living paycheck to paycheck on unstable resource money. And the real shockwaves don't just hit royal ledgers, they hit the marketplace and the kitchen table. Here's where the story jumps from palaces into your pantry. As those tons of silver pour into Europe, something simple but devastating happens. There's suddenly more money chasing about the same amount of goods. More coins, same wheat harvest, same number of shoes, same number of day laborers looking for work. Result? Prices climb. Across Western Europe, from the late 1400s to the mid-1600s, prices rise about 6-fold. Historians call this era the Price Revolution. An annual inflation rate between 1 and 1.5%, tiny by modern standards, but in a world used to almost no inflation, it feels like the laws of nature are changing. In Castile, the heart of Spain, prices for basic goods jump 300 to 400% over the 16th century. Bread, wine, wool, everything costs more. Spanish thinkers notice. At the University of Salamanca, clerics like Martín de Azpilicueta puzzle over the link between new silver and rising prices. They write that where money is abundant, goods are expensive, a rough sketch of what economists now call the quantity theory of money. But theory doesn't feed your kids. If you're a day laborer whose pay barely moves while prices leap ahead, each year your wage buys a little less bread, a little less oil, a little less wool cloth. If you live on a fixed rent or church stipend, inflation quietly saws off the legs of your livelihood. So what do you do if money itself stops making sense? Some riot. Many more quietly exit the game. Faced with unpredictable cash prices and the rising cost of living, huge numbers of Spaniards drift out of towns and smaller cities back into the countryside. There, as tenants of big landlords, they can pay rent in kind, with a share of crops instead of volatile silver coins. They sow wheat, raise sheep, spin their own wool, make their own tools. They insulate themselves from the chaos of money by avoiding it. Spain, which once boasted several cities over 100,000 people, de-urbanizes. Towns shrink, markets thin out. A strong urban middle class, the merchants and craftsmen who drive consumer economies in Italy, the Netherlands, England, and France, never really takes root. In a bitter twist, the more silver floods in, the more ordinary Spaniards retreat from a money economy entirely. Now zoom into a Castilian workshop around 1500. The furnace glows white-orange. A blacksmith hammers a Toledo blade, famous across Europe for its strength. Nearby, looms clack as weavers turn Spanish wool into fine cloth. Glassmakers blow elegant vessels, bubbles of molten sand glowing like suns. Under Moorish rule and into early Christian times, Spain had real industrial muscle, steel-making, textiles, glass. These weren't just for local use, they were competitive exports. Now jump ahead to the early 1600s. Those same forges are cooling. Looms stand silent. Across Castile, the wool trade is collapsing. In Salamanca, the number of sheep drops by 60%. In Toledo, woolen production shrinks by 3/4. In the northern port of Santander, 66 ships once carried 17,000 sacks of wool in 1572. 50 years later, just 11 ships leave with barely 500 sacks. What happened? Remember those ships unloading silver in Seville? That treasure doesn't stay locked in Spanish chests, it leaks out. Fast. Because Spanish goods, battered by high wages and high prices, can't compete with cheaper manufactures from Northern Europe. A Dutch or English merchant can buy Spanish silver, sail home, use it to fund industries with lower labor costs, then bring finished textiles, ironware, and ships back to Spain and sell them, profitably, even after taxes. Economists have a name for this pattern: Dutch disease. A booming resource sector sucks labor and capital out of manufacturing. The currency, or in this case the price level, rises. Domestic industries can't compete and wither. It shows up today when oil-rich countries suddenly import almost everything while their own factories close. In Spain, Dutch disease could have been called Moctezuma's curse. The riches seized from American empires become a slow poison inside the Spanish economy. If you can just dig wealth out of foreign mountains, why invest in your own workshops and foundries? Add another self-inflicted wound: talent flight. After 1492, the Spanish Inquisition and the Crown expelled Jews and later Moriscos, Muslims who had converted to Christianity. These communities aren't just religious minorities, they're deeply involved in trade, crafts, finance, and advanced agriculture. When they're driven out, they take their skills to more tolerant places: the Ottoman Empire, North Africa, the Netherlands. Spain doesn't just lose people, it loses know-how. The elite that remains often sneers at trade and industry as vulgar. The ideal life for a nobleman is living off rents and royal pensions, funded by silver streaming in from a continent away. Why dirty your hands building a textile mill when a galleon can pay for your estate? Meanwhile, Dutch, English, and French nobles quietly invest in ships, mills, canals, and trading companies. The gap between countries obsessed with production and one hooked on plunder starts to widen. And while Spanish workshops dim, the war machine keeps grinding on. Step away from the forges and back into the war rooms. Under Charles V and his son Philip II, Spain is less a country than a stitched-together war engine. The Habsburg inheritance stretches across half of Europe: Spain, Naples, Sicily, the Netherlands, Austria, and claims to the Holy Roman Empire. Defending this patchwork against France, the Ottomans, rising Protestant states, and rebellious subjects is breathtakingly expensive. Charles V fights the French in Italy, battles Protestants in Germany, holds off the Turks in the Mediterranean, and tries to keep the Low Countries in line. Philip II inherits his father's debts and enemies, then adds more: rebellious Dutch Calvinists, Elizabethan England, and a resurgent France. One theatre sums up the strain: the 80 Years' War in the Netherlands. The Spanish army there is among the finest in the world, but it must be supplied, paid, and rotated across long, vulnerable sea routes. When the silver shipments to pay them fail to arrive on time, mutinies explode. Spanish troops sack cities they were sent to protect. The Spanish fury in Antwerp in 1576 isn't just brutality, it's a symptom of financial collapse. And behind these eruptions is that seductive river of bullion. Because silver gives the monarchy something incredibly dangerous: the illusion that it doesn't really need its own taxpayers. In England and the Dutch Republic, governments have to bargain. Parliaments vote taxes, merchants and landowners demand accountability. Slowly, messy, they build stable, predictable tax systems. On that foundation, they can issue bonds, long-term government IOUs. Investors trust those bonds because they know taxes will service them. Interest rates fall. States can borrow cheaply to build navies, canals, and fortresses. Spain, plugged into New World silver, skips that hard work. Why fight with the Cortes for new taxes when the next fleet from Veracruz can fill the treasury? This is classic resource addiction. The crown becomes decoupled from its own society. It doesn't have to nurture domestic industry to expand its tax base. It doesn't need a thriving middle class. It just needs the mines to keep producing. So, instead of a maturing tax bond system, Spain gets a financial roller coaster. Cash floods in with big convoys, then dries up. Creditors are paid until the next storm or pirate attack. Vendors who supply the army or navy can't rely on being paid promptly, or at all. What do you do if you're a Spanish entrepreneur asked to build ships for a client whose income swings wildly with the weather in the Caribbean? You either refuse or you demand a premium. Many step back. Foreign suppliers, Genoese bankers, Flemish merchants step in, taking Spanish silver in exchange. Every crisis deepens the pattern. When silver falters, the crown debases coinage, especially small copper money. More coins, less purchasing power. Prices jump again. Confidence in money erodes further. Ordinary people retreat even more from the cash economy. Cities weaken, the tax base shrinks. By the mid-1600s, the Spanish monarchy is in a trap of its own making. Too weak to tax effectively, too addicted to silver to reform, and too overextended militarily to pull back without humiliation. Now watch the 17th century unfold like a slow-motion crash. Philip III inherits the throne in 1598. He's no Charles V, no Philip II. He delegates power to favourites, validos, who rule in his name. The Duke of Lerma, his chief favorite, is more interested in palaces and patronage than in repairing the state. In 1609, the crown expels the Moriscos, descendants of Spain's Muslims. The move plays well with hardline Catholics. Economically, it's disastrous. In regions like Valencia, Moriscos are the backbone of agriculture and irrigation. Suddenly, whole valleys are half empty, fields go to weeds. The money system grows more chaotic. The crown pumps out more copper vellon coinage, trying to stretch resources. Nominal prices rise even faster. The gap between the face value of coins and their metal content widens. People hoard good silver coins and dump bad copper in daily use. If coins themselves can't be trusted, how do you plan for next year? Or next week? Philip IV comes to the throne in 1621. His favorite, the Count Duke of Olivares, is ambitious, energetic, and convinced that only a centralized, modernized monarchy can save Spain. He launches his Union of Arms, a plan to share the military burden across all the kingdoms under the Spanish crown, not just Castile. On paper, it's more fair. In practice, it detonates old compromises. Here, we hit another key turning point. In 1640, multiple fault lines rip open at once. Portugal rebels, crowns its own king, and breaks away, reclaiming its overseas empire. Catalonia erupts in revolt and briefly places itself under French protection. Naples and Sicily see their own uprisings. Even Andalusia whispers about secession. 3 years later, in 1643, at the Battle of Rocroi, French troops smash the famous Spanish tercios. It's not just a battlefield defeat. It's the moment Europe realizes the Spanish war machine can be beaten. The aura of invincibility that had shielded Spain since the days of Charles V is gone. On paper, Spain still holds vast lands. In reality, the center is buckling. 4 more bankruptcies, from 1627 through the 1660s, crater what's left of royal credit. Harvest failures, plague, and war finish the job of hollowing out central Castile. And yet, even as the economy crumbles and the empire frays, the culture burns brighter than ever. Velázquez paints Las Meninas, a masterpiece of Baroque complexity. Calderón writes philosophical dramas about dreams and reality. Quevedo and other writers pour their anxieties about national decline into biting satire. It's as if Spain senses the rot beneath the gold leaf and can't stop turning it into art. Now, picture the last Habsburg king, Charles II, known across Europe as the Bewitched. He's physically frail, sickly, plagued by illnesses and rumors of impotence. In portraits, he looks ghostly, his jaw slack, his Habsburg chin exaggerated almost to caricature. His body becomes a metaphor for his dynasty, exhausted, overbred, out of time. His court is a nest of intrigue. Factions maneuver around the question everyone whispers. When this man dies childless, who gets Spain? Foreign ambassadors watch every move. France wants the throne for a Bourbon prince, tying Spain to its own rising power. The Austrian Habsburgs want to keep the inheritance in the family. England and the Dutch watch from the sidelines, determined that no single power will dominate Europe again. Inside Spain, something else is happening. In the midst of this gloomy twilight, you start to see flickers of reform. Ministers like the Duke of Medinaceli and the Count of Oropesa try to rationalize taxes, stabilize the coinage, and reduce the most egregious corruption. They listen to arbitristas, pamphleteers and thinkers, warning that silver has become a curse. They manage a few modest successes. Spain still holds on to most of its American possessions. Colonial cities in Mexico and Peru grow. In Spanish America, populations begin to recover from the catastrophic plagues of the 1500s. Trade across the Atlantic continues, if on shakier terms. But within Europe, Spain's days as the undisputed hegemon are clearly over. Then comes the next major hinge of history. In 1700, Charles II dies without an heir. His body is barely cold when his will sets Europe on fire. He leaves the entire Spanish Empire to Philip of Anjou, a Bourbon prince, grandson of Louis XIV of France. The result is the War of the Spanish Succession, a continent-spanning conflict over who gets to control what's left of Spain's global puzzle. By the time the dust settles in 1713, a Bourbon prince does indeed sit on the Spanish throne as Philip V. But Spain has lost its possessions in Italy and the Low Countries. What remains is still a large empire, especially in the Americas, but one haunted by a century and a half of misused wealth. The new Bourbon dynasty eventually brings more systematic reforms. Under Charles III, in the mid-1700s, Spain modernizes parts of its tax system, prunes some privileges, and tries to encourage industry and infrastructure. But by then, the race has changed. Britain and the Netherlands have spent the 1600s building the deep institutions of modern capitalism: parliaments, stock markets, credible public debts, naval insurance, and a culture that prizes trade and invention. They're about to ride those foundations into the Industrial Revolution. Spain, which once mocked those lands as poor and barbaric, finds itself late to a game it helped bankroll but never learned to play. So what does this whole arc actually tell us? It's easy to laugh at 16th century kings obsessed with silver. But look a little closer, and Spain's gold addiction starts to sound uncomfortably familiar. Think of a modern country that suddenly strikes oil. Overnight, government revenues explode. Skyscrapers rise from the desert. Imported luxury cars crowd the highways. Meanwhile, local factories shut down because it's cheaper to buy everything from abroad. For a while, it feels like a miracle. No need for boring stuff like building a diverse industrial base, training engineers, or designing a fair tax code. The resource money covers it all. Until it doesn't. Prices fall, wells run dry, or the world moves on to different energy. If you haven't used the boom to build something deeper, schools, ports, reliable courts, a culture that rewards work instead of proximity to power, the hangover is brutal. That's Spain from 1500 to 1700 in slow motion. The empire's leaders believed that money was wealth, that silver dug from Andean mountains was the same as productive capacity at home, that resources abroad could permanently substitute for hard reforms and hard choices in Castile, Aragon, and beyond. They weren't alone in that belief. For centuries, empires had lived off conquest and tribute. But as Spain rose and fell, the rules of the game were changing. Rome once sneered at Britain for lacking gold. Yet the Industrial Revolution began in those coal-soaked islands. China and India were once richer, larger, and better endowed with people and resources than Europe. Yet they lagged in industrialization, for 2 centuries. Spain's story drives the point home. Money is not wealth. Resources are not always riches. Wealth is the ability to produce, to turn raw materials, energy, and human creativity into goods and services people want. It's also about trust. Trust in money, in contracts, in governments that don't default whenever the weather on the Atlantic turns bad. Spain, at its height, had the most feared infantry in Europe. It commanded more territory than any other Catholic power. Its art and literature rivaled anything in history. But it never fully made the leap from plunder to production, from bullion to broad-based prosperity. Instead, it rode a glittering wave of silver straight into a long decline. Before we leave that dock in Seville, go back there one last time. The sun is setting. Another treasure fleet has arrived, but it's smaller now. The coffers are lighter. Much of the silver is already earmarked to pay foreign creditors waiting in Antwerp or Genoa. The crowd is thinner. Some warehouses are shuttered. In a nearby tavern, a grizzled veteran of the Dutch wars drinks cheap wine. He's fought for king and faith in Flanders and Italy. He's watched comrades die with Santiago on their lips. Now he hears rumors that in Amsterdam, merchants grow richer than dukes without ever drawing a sword. He shakes his head and mutters something bitter about all that silver and still no bread. Outside, a young clerk from the Casa de Contratación hurries past, clutching ledgers. He's heard of new ideas from across the channel, of Englishmen debating balanced budgets, parliaments, and something called public credit. He wonders whether Spain could ever change that much. Far away, in the thin air of Potosí, indigenous laborers descend into the mountain's dark lungs, breathing mercury-laced fumes, trading their lives for silver bars that, by the time they reach Europe, will have lost much of their real value. And somewhere, in another cold northern shipyard, a Dutch builder lays the keel of a new merchantman, paid for partly with Spanish silver, and prepares to sail into the future. Spain's gold addiction wasn't just a national tragedy, it was a turning point. It showed, in brutal detail, that the easy road of plunder and resource windfalls leads to a dead end. It's a lesson that echoes into our own century every time a country strikes oil, digs up rare minerals, or rides a commodity boom and thinks, "We're rich. Problem solved." Because history keeps whispering back, in the language of collapsed empires and rusting fleets. Silver isn't wealth. Gold isn't a plan. And if you treat natural resources like a shortcut instead of a tool, the real curse isn't in the mines. It's in the mirror.